So if you watched my most recent video, you would have been made aware of an incident that occurred outside Wycombe police station, whereby I was subjected to insults followed by an assault, all whilst being falsely imprisoned by two police officers, PC 7351 Thomas and our knee enthusiast, PC 4246 Lewis Kent. So this was actually in response to me filming the police station from a public pavement. Both officers were certain that I was committing an offence, and after some legislation bingo involving Section 1 of PACE and Section 43 of the Terrorist Act, they finally decided to settle on Section 47 of the Terrorist Act to detain and subsequently search me. As the legislation clearly illustrates, a senior police officer must give authorization in order for this legislation to be used. PC Thomas had other ideas and decided to bring it upon himself to make that decision for his superiors and proceeded to illegally use the power anyway. So I'd like you to meet PC Lewis Kent 4246. Mr. Kent is fond of using four-letter words when addressing members of the public that are engaging in lawful activity that he doesn't necessarily agree with. He doesn't rely on legislation or the law to determine if somebody is right or wrong, because after all, that would mean actually having to know the law, and God forbid a serving police officer of 6 years should have to know that. So when Lewis's public order swearing strategy doesn't work, he's got no problems resorting to excessive force to make sure his point is heard. Kneeing members of the public in the back once they are already subdued was one of the strategies in Lewis's excessive force arsenal. All whilst this was going on, I noticed that he actually had bruises on his knuckles, so reassuring me that Lewis was in fact no stranger to violence, and such measures were probably commonplace for him. You know, if you were ever in doubt or needed reminding, this video clearly demonstrates that Thames Valley Police do in fact employ criminals themselves. As for PC Thomas, on this occasion, I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt and spare publicising his personal information on YouTube. I will of course still be suing him for the misuse of Section 47 of the Terrorism Act. That being said, there were times in which he did actually show me a bit of respect and ask me if I was okay. So on that basis alone, although to a limited extent he did uphold somewhat of a duty of care as a police officer, so for that reason alone, I'm going to spare him the embarrassment of having his face and name on YouTube. Believe it or not, I'm not a police hater and treat everyone on an individual basis. So anyway, moving on, whilst being detained, both officers demanded that I give my details. Obviously I refused. They arrested me under Section 50 of the Police Reform Act, which, if you're not aware, is an offence to not provide an officer with your name, date of birth and address when asked. I refused to get into the car with them and they had to use force to restrain me and get me into the car. PC Lewis then further arrested me for obstructing police. Looking back, this might have been a silly thing to do, but after all, I am human, and believe it or not, I didn't fancy taking orders from the same tyrants that had just trampled all over my rights. So PC Lewis assured me that he'd be seizing my phone and that I wouldn't be getting it back. I made him aware that thousands of people watch my videos and that he was foolish for not deleting my footage when he had the chance. He tried to claim that he didn't care and that he'd look good on camera and tried to brush it off, all whilst his face told a completely different story. It was at this particular moment he'd in fact realised that he'd messed up massively. I know you were hurting, buddy. You were right to be nervous. It's okay, mate. I was then taken from Wycombe to Aylesbury police station, which is roughly 15 miles away. It took about 30 minutes. All this time I remained in cuffs. Once we arrived in Aylesbury, I was booked into Aylesbury police station, where both officers convinced the duty sergeant that I'd been extremely difficult throughout the arrest and that they couldn't be sure of whether or not I was concealing a weapon. Can you believe that? The sergeant bought this story and proceeded to authorise a strip search of myself. I was then taken into a room and strip searched. Nothing was found. I later provided my details to the sergeant on the basis that I would otherwise be charged for the Section 50. I was then taken into a cell, and after 2 or 3 hours a charging decision was made. The Section 50 was dropped, but I was to be charged with obstructing police. The sergeant offered me a conditional caution on the basis that I wrote a written apology. I agreed and wrote the written apology for resisting. A lot of people are going to get onto me for this and hate me for agreeing to this, but you've got to understand I live 40 miles away from Aylesbury, and had I been charged, would have had to travel all that way for my day in court. I already put myself through enough trying to expose these thugs, so if you can just cut me a bit of slack on this one, I would appreciate it. You know, sometimes you must lose the battle to win the war. So shortly afterwards, I was in fact released from custody. So in conclusion, the events surrounding the incidents that happened are still very fresh, and I will not rush into bringing forward civil proceedings or in fact private prosecutions. Rest assured, proceedings will be brought, but first I must gather as much information and advice as possible. This is not a process that can afford mistakes or inconsistencies. Both officers responsible will be made to account for their actions in order for me to be able to achieve the best possible result for myself and for the public, the process must be done properly and perfectly. I mean, all in all, this experience in the video itself demonstrated more than ever why it is so important for me to keep auditing. Admittedly, when I first began, my motives were somewhat unclear. I didn't know what I was trying to achieve. Like, there was no end game per se. As time has gone on, I've begun to understand the broken nature in which the police systems operate and how they're so confident in avoiding accountability for their actions. I mean, I don't know why it takes somebody of my particular background and stature to be one of the few responsible for leading this charge. You know, I don't have a lot of experience as such. That being said, somebody has got to do it. Whilst I may not be the best equipped person to be bringing such action, I know that with right advice and support from the viewers, I'm confident we can make things happen. We're up in the levs. We're aiming for the head and only for the head from now on. Aim high business.